And there was a moment where the self really fell away, and what I was looking at just stood out all on its own without any reference point to a me, that I just knew something was there that I hadn't understood before. And it felt very freeing, and I wanted to know more about that.
Hello and welcome to the Metta Hour podcast with Sharon Salzberg. I'm Lily Cushman. I produce this podcast. And today we are back with another Fireside Chat. This is episode 245 and our fourth of these Fireside Chat series. Today Sharon is joined by longtime dharma teacher Guy Armstrong. This series is hosted by IMS Online and features conversations with dharma teachers about the early days of their practice, some of the most impactful moments they've had with their own teachers. Guy, if you don't know him, has been leading insight meditation retreats since the mid-'80s, both in the United States and Europe and Australia. He has been a meditation practitioner since the mid-'70s, and his training has included living as a monk for a year in the Thai forest lineage. Guy has gone on to be a member of the Spirit Rock Teachers Council and a guiding teacher at the Insight Meditation Society. He also has a wonderful book, Emptiness, a practical guide for meditators. And he's been on the pod before. It's been quite a while. But if you want to check out that other episode, you can dig into our archives. And this is a great conversation for practitioners because Guy and Sharon get into a lot of the nitty-gritty in practice, a lot of nuance around emptiness, about mental noting technique. Guy shares about his first encounters with meditation and his first encounters with the teachings of anatta, emptiness. There's lots of old stories about the early retreats and some of the real nuggets that played an important role in Guy's life as a meditation student and teacher, different advice from his teachers, and just kind of what shape his path has taken since 1976. As part of this recording, Guy and Sharon also take some questions from the audience members that attended this live through IMS Online. So this one is chock full of great nuance and detail and super helpful, especially for some of the inner workings of practice. Guy also leads a meditation about halfway through the conversation that is a meditation on emptiness. Before we get to the conversation, I just want to point you to some new offerings that Sharon has that you may or may not have heard of. This has been the year of the audiobook recordings for Sharon. She recently released an audiobook of Finding Your Way, which is her most recent gift book. Also out this year, Sharon recorded for the first time ever an audiobook version of her very first book, Loving Kindness. And so for you, our listeners, many of who prefer this format to reading books, both of those are available in all the places that you get your audiobooks. So let's dive into this fireside chat. Sharon Salzberg and Guy Armstrong.
I'm so delighted to be here with all of you and to be here with my friend Guy Armstrong. I've been wanting to talk to him about so many things, including the book he wrote on emptiness, which is very exciting for me. So hello. Hi, Guy.
Hi, Sharon. It's great to see you, especially since COVID hit. We've just had very little time to hang out. So it's great to be able to spend this time together, and thank you for having me.
Well, Guy was just here in Barry, Mass for these meetings, and so I did get to see him, and it's a kind of new and rare thing for me since I've been so much in solitude for all these years. So uh, it's a Zoom life largely for me still, and I feel very close to people that I encounter on Zoom. So this is also good. So I'm just have an amazing visual memory, Guy, of first meeting you, but I can't remember when it was. I remember sitting in one of those interview rooms at the Insight Meditation Society, and there you were. So when was that?
Most likely, it was 1977. The first time we crossed paths was my first retreat, which was Lama Foundation in
Okay.
'76. But I can't swear that we had a one-to-one meeting then. But then I moved to IMS to be a yogi in '77, and then we had a bunch of retreat. Well, I can think of at least 2 retreats we had that year. So probably it was one of those.
Yeah, that's my visual recollection is not Lama Foundation, where being very young at the time, I was also seeing meditators at like 7 in the morning or something like that. So that's all wiped out. But I do see you at IMS. So we had just opened in 1976. So you were a very early adapter.
I felt fortunate to have met you and Joseph and Jack as early as I did in '76. The Lama Foundation retreat, it was a little bit primitive on the physical side. All the men were staying on one wooden platform with a canvas covering. We just rolled out our mats and slept there. And then when it rained, everything got soaked. But it was so great to be introduced to the depths of Vipassana that way.
So what brought you to well, was that your first encounter with meditation, or what brought you to your first encounter in meditation?
Yeah. It's a little bit of a long story. I grew up in a suburb of St. Louis called Webster Groves, which was very kind of middle America, white, middle class lifestyle. And Buddhism was the furthest thing from a curriculum. But I liked to read back then, and I was going through the local bookstore, and this book stood out to me, which was The Way of Zen by Alan Watts. And it had an image of the Buddha on the cover. And for whatever reason, I bought that. I didn't read it right away, but I read it when I got into college, and it really intrigued me. So first I was just drawn to the philosophical interest that the Buddha's teachings presented, and especially this idea of not self, which Alan Watts expounded on, and D.T. Suzuki, which are the books I was reading back then. And so I would wander around my campus at night, sort of reflecting on there wasn't really a self here, and try to figure out what that meant. And I actually had a very strong anatta experience on one of those walks and reflections that made a big imprint. It like opened up this dimension of freedom. But the funny thing about Watts and Suzuki, nobody told you had to meditate. So it was years later before I happened upon a yoga teacher in Palo Alto who was a student of Dhiravamsa, a Thai monk, and she taught Vipassana meditation along with the yoga. I came for the yoga, but I really got hooked on the Vipassana. And then there was a flyer. We had a spiritual bookstore in Palo Alto, and there was a flyer about the retreat at Lama Foundation. And I piled into my Toyota station wagon with 3 friends, and we drove out and sat the retreat together.
That's fantastic. Just in case anybody is not familiar with the terminology from Pali, the language of the original Buddhist text, Vipassana means insight or insight meditation, and anatta is selflessness or emptiness, could be a way of describing it. So I want to go into several aspects of that story. One is you don't know what had you buy the book. That is so interesting. And I know so many stories like that. Something arises that maybe there are no words for even, but and so we show up. I heard kind of similar story from John Kabat-Zinn, who was a student at MIT and saw a flyer up on the wall for a talk on Zen. And he said it was put on by the humanities department, which, as he put it, is not why most people are at MIT, like they're studying science. And he said he didn't even know why he went, but he went to the talk, which was the beginning of everything for him. So it's quite a moment sometimes, just the accumulation of who knows what from the past.
It reminds me of the advice that Trungpa Rinpoche gave to you about going to Asia for the
Yeah.
first time. What did he tell you? You were
He
asking about
said,
finding a teacher.
yeah, he was, I was going to college in Buffalo, New York, and I was actually going to India through a college independent study program. And I didn't know where to go, really. I mean, I knew I wanted to study meditation. That was the project that I had created. And I was interested in Buddhism because that was the Asian philosophy class that I had taken in college. And Trungpa Rinpoche came to Buffalo to give a talk maybe 3 or 4 days before I was about to leave with this small group of friends to go to India. And he gave a talk, and then they asked for written questions. So I wrote out the question: about to go to India to study Buddhist meditation. Do you have a suggestion of where I should go? And he had this big pile of written questions in front of him, and he like reached his hand into the pile and pulled out my question, and he read it out loud. And then he said, I think you had perhaps best follow the pretense of accident. So that was it, like no addresses, no handy monastery guidebook, I think you had perhaps best follow the pretense of accident. And it really was kind of that way, it was like I went to India. I was also very bent on very practical, direct instruction. I wasn't particularly interested in learning the philosophy or becoming a Buddhist at all, or rejecting anything else. And I started out in Dharamsala because I knew the Dalai Lama was there and I heard he was a Buddhist. And that didn't quite work because it was one of those situations that don't really work. It's like I went to the class and the translator was gone because he had to see the dentist who was at the other end of India. So that was 2 weeks. And then I went back 2 weeks later, and then something else went wrong. And I was in a restaurant and I overheard a conversation about a Hatha yoga conference that was going to happen in New Delhi. So I thought, oh, I'll go there. And that's where I'll find a teacher and actually learn how to meditate. And I went there, and it was this really dismal experience, the low point of which was when the yogis and the swamis were up on the stage pushing and shoving against each other to be the first to grab the mic to speak. And I thought, this is never going to happen for me. And then it turned out that Dan Goleman, who at the time was a graduate student in psychology studying meditation, he was giving a talk at that conference. And he mentioned at the end of the talk that he was on his way to this town called Bodh Gaya, where he was going to do an intensive 10-day meditation retreat, which was really like an immersion retreat in the direct how to practice. And I thought, that's it. And I followed him there, and it was it.
Hmm. Who
So
was teaching?
it was S.N. Goenka, who was my first teacher.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So I want to pick up also on what you said about emptiness or no self, because it's said in the Buddhist teaching that there are 3 main kind of universal characteristics in life. One is impermanence,
Mm.
which is both like the beginnings of things, arising, renewal, like springtime. And of course, the endings of things, the fleeting nature of everything. It's all moving, it's in transition, everything within us, everything outside of us. And then the second universal aspect of truth is dukkha, which is the old fashioned translation of suffering, which I like because that's how I learned it. But it doesn't only mean, grave suffering, terrible injury, or something like that. It's also insecurity, unreliability, um, dissatisfaction. A common translation, which I have a hard time personally, although I know very great scholars who use it, is stress.
Mm.
But because I'm so used to suffering, that's a little bit of a stretch for me. And the third universal aspect of reality of the characteristics is anatta, or no self, or emptiness. So it's also said in the teaching that they each of these three can serve as a doorway to liberation. As we go deeply into one, first of all, we find the other two, but also it brings us to a state of living differently, of being free. And so it's also said that it can be common that one has more of an affinity for one than the other two. So for me, that was certainly suffering. Um, and I used to hear teachings about anatta, or no self, and I'd sit there and think, what are they talking about? I don't have a clue. And I met our friend Fred von Allman 50 some years ago in India. And he was also a student of Buddhist teaching. And he said to me the first time he heard a teaching about no self, he so deeply knew it was true
Mm.
that he said it was like the hairs on his body just stood up.
Mhm.
And I said to him, I don't understand that. I just sit there and think, what are they talking about? Aligned with Fred's experience. Is that true?
It took me a while to get conviction about that.
Okay.
Just this experience that I had while I was walking around the campus at night. And there was a moment where the self really fell away. And what I was looking at just stood out all on its own without any reference point to a me, that I just knew something was there that I hadn't understood before. And it felt very freeing, and I wanted to know more about that. So it became definitely the area of philosophical interest that most drew me into meditation and into Buddhism. And yeah, continued to explore, the different layers of the meaning of emptiness as it's grown up in the Buddhist tradition. It's become a central inquiry for me.
So maybe we should go into emptiness a little bit, because in a experiential way, just certainly in case anyone is like me and sitting here thinking, what are they talking about? I wonder if you could talk about some of those different layers or levels.
Mhm. Well, it's often presented that impermanence is the first doorway for people, and that was the way it came out in my deepening meditation. I couldn't summon up these moments where the self just kind of miraculously fell away and the world was just standing out on its own. I mean, that's happened occasionally since, but not with any regularity. But as I started, and this was often through 3-month retreats that I sat with you and Joseph and Jack, the teachings on impermanence, and we were doing the Mahasi Sayadaw noting practice, and that would gain some momentum, and you just see everything that you looked at was just about to fall away, and then it fell away. And then I would have kept a sort of running commentary on what was happening through thinking, and then that started to fall away. And when the running commentary fell away, I saw there wasn't anything continuing. Thoughts were coming and going, sounds, sensations, everything else was coming, and there wasn't any center to it. So in kind of ongoing experience, impermanence really became the doorway for me. And the Mahasi Sayadaw noting practice was just so helpful for that.
So in mental noting, just to go into a little more detail about that, um, you place a quiet or silent, really, mental label on your predominant experience. So with the breath, you might be supporting that awareness through noting in, out, or rising, falling. And then if something comes up strongly, like a thought. You might know, thinking, and let's go there, and then back to emptiness for a moment. Because for me, studying with those teachers who were a little later, that's not Goenka's approach, but my later teachers were teaching mental noting, somewhat later. It was a really important technique for me in a lot of ways, but also kind of awkward in the beginning because I would sit there. The noting is meant to be simple, and if the word comes, pretty much, but I would sit there and think, is this pain or is this discomfort? Is there something in between pain and discomfort? It was like somebody sitting down reading a thesaurus, which was a complete waste of time. Later on, it proved to be, when I got more used to it, it was really useful because, first of all, it's an energy boost and it's easy in meditation and very easy for me to move into this state they call sinking mind, where your concentration is deepening, but you don't have enough energy in your system. And I call it the ooze. You're just kind of oozing along. And the noting will actually help to balance that out. And also, if you have the habit, as I also do, of tremendous digression, like something arises and I think, what am I going to do about that? And then I'm off and running. To use the mental note just cuts through a lot of that and brings me back to, oh, this is what's happening right now. So I'm just wondering about your experience of mental noting.
Well, like you, it became a really foundational practice for me. Uh, I liked it because in doing mental noting, you really notice when you're present and you really notice when you're absent because the notes have stopped. And because it puts that emphasis on being present moment after moment after moment, it also builds up concentration. Uh, as a Vipassana practice, it's one of the best I can think of to develop that power of concentration. And the returning again and again, to come up with a word that fits the experience is hard work. So once we got to choiceless attention, which means you let the mind go anywhere and you're invited to notice instead of just noting, it felt like a big relief to do that. But then also with the choiceless attention and the dropping off of noting, there wasn't the clear marker of when I was away so much. So the concentration tended to drop, and then it would be helpful to pick up the mental noting again. But what I really loved about that practice overall and Mahasi Sayadaw's instructions is that nothing was left out of the meditation. Anything that we could experience could be the focus of mindfulness. And that gave the meditation this incredible breadth that worked well in retreat and carried over, really beautifully into daily life. I have a lot of respect and appreciation for that technique.
So let's go back to emptiness because it's so hard sometimes to describe in words. Just sometimes where I think a tradition like Zen is so poetic, rather than didactic. What that experience is when you say the world is standing on its own. Um, it has flavors for me of like interconnection rather than something being like an entity, solid and substantial, like a tree or a house or something like that. Is also a combination of conditions, and it's about relationship. It's part of a network. It also has um a flavor of like some of the big confusions around things like emptiness or no self are things like an idea that everything becomes like a soup. There's no distinct identity anymore. And as one person once said to me in a retreat, they pointed to somebody else and they said, if there's no self, how come she's not paying my taxes? Like, don't we all just kind of morph together into this blob?
Mm-hmm.
Or that it's blank, it's like void and nothing happens, but things seem to be happening. I see and hear, and there's consciousness, and so it's not an easy explanation.
No, it's not. Just as you say, there first of all, there are cultural objections to it, the ones that you mentioned. And the word is not very warm and fuzzy. Who's going to want to gravitate to a religion based on emptiness? It just does not sound inviting. Conceptually, the counterpoint to emptiness is suchness. And that means that if you take the self out of the center of the universe, what remains is the whole universe in all its brilliant glory. The flowers and the trees and the sky and the birds and other people and the love and all of that. None of that goes away. And when we take the self-centeredness out of it, it becomes just the richest expression possible of what's here. So that initial word, I think the Buddha employed it deliberately because it's the same kind of empty word in Pali. Sunya just means, absent, void of, empty of. It's not a beckoning kind of word, but it opens doors to, as you say, the sense of interconnection and a much more loving embrace of the world, in my experience.
What's your book actually called?
My book is actually called Emptiness, a practical guide for meditators. Thank you for the cue. Because it does have more than one meaning. And, it's important to get over some of the resistance and look into some of the depth. But one of the ways that it has been used later, not so much in the Pali Canon, but in later Buddhism, is the sense of insubstantiality. And again, the Mahasi Sayadaw noting technique leads in the direction of this understanding also. Because as we pay attention to sounds arising and passing, sensations arising and passing, thoughts coming and going, we see how in any given moment, each of them is so ephemeral. There's not a solid thing there. And the Buddha uses different language to describe this insubstantiality. He doesn't actually use the word sunya, but he uses synonyms of it, like void, hollow, like that. But there is a discourse that points very directly to the insubstantial nature of all sense phenomena. And that's the second layer of the term emptiness. And then the third layer is really looking closely at the faculty of consciousness itself. Like, what is it in the mind that reveals the whole world to us? As people are sitting looking at the screen and looking at you and me, what's that faculty of mind that is knowing Sharon's white and pink blouse, that's knowing the flowers that are over my right shoulder? That's consciousness that reveals all that stuff. But if you look for consciousness, where is it? It's hard to find exactly. So consciousness is also insubstantial in that way. And when we see the insubstantiality of consciousness, it's an invitation to see the whole world as an arising in our own mind. And that's a central truth that the Buddha pointed to. The world is arising in our own mind, not separate, part of our mind. So to me, that's a really liberating kind of understanding. When we get a feel for that, it cuts through the duality of self and other that a lot of alienation and fear is based around.
Well, sometimes people ask, like, they don't feel in their meditation practice, let's say on retreat, though it doesn't have to be on retreat, that they're getting that kind of insight. And so sometimes we point to, well, actually two things. One is the kind of lack of control or power. Like, you can't say, I've decided never to be afraid again, and have that be successful. It's not a question of will or domination, because when conditions come together for something to arise, it will arise. If I were in control of the body, of the mind, it would be a different story. And if I were in control of this world, it would certainly be a different story. But conditions need to come together for something to arise. So I remember Munindra one of my earlier teachers saying to me something like, "Why are you so upset about this thought that has come up in your mind? Did you invite it? Did you say at like 7:30, I'd like to be filled with self-hatred?" No. But when conditions come together for something to arise, it will arise. Can we do anything to affect the conditions? Yes. But can we determine? Can we absolutely control? No. And so it doesn't sound like it's a great insight, but it actually is,
Mhm.
to see the thoughts and the feelings and the sensations that are arising, not because we want them to be there, is actually an insight into anatta. And then the other one is, or another avenue is watching the connection between the body and the mind to see that linkage. Like you're sitting in meditation, a certain sensation arises in your body, you feel it to be painful. Because of that painful feeling, you decide to move because of that decision, that intention in the mind. Your body moves. Because your body moves, there's a new sensation, and you just watch the play of elements. And you realize, oh, this can all be happening. Like the whole universe of experience can be arising without a self, solid, unchanging, disconnected from everything else, in control, happening. And so they neither of them seem very dramatic or grand as insights, but they're both important doorways to that understanding.
Yeah, they're really profound. I think this area of control is something that we could talk about more in our Dharma teachings because I think it's actually a direct outcome of the second noble truth. Now, the first noble truth that the Buddha taught is there's suffering or unsatisfactoriness in life. And the second one is that the deepest source of that is craving. It's our wanting it to be different than it is. And so as we meditate, we see this tendency come up again and again and again to try and make things different than they are. We want the sensation to go away. We want that mood or hindrance not to be arising. And this wanting expresses itself through an attempt to control. And that, to me, that's basically what the self is this ongoing insertion of our own will into the flow of conditions. And of course, sometimes we need to do that. If we're sick, we need to take action to make the body better. If there's injustice in society, we want to take action to try to remedy that. So, on a personal level, on a family level, big level, we don't abdicate trying to influence things in a wholesome way. But when it comes to meditation and we're just sitting with our own experience, the attempt to control is more disturbing than it is helpful. And I remember, I'm sure a lot of our viewers know Rodney Smith, who's been a teacher at IMS for a long time and a good friend of both of ours. Rodney and I were monks together for a while in Thailand. And we would just bat Dharma ideas around back and forth when we were hanging out. And so one morning we were on alms round. We did our alms round together through nearby rice fields and going by local villagers' houses. We were walking back from the alms round, and Rodney turned around and just said to me, "Guy, the ego is just friction." And that kind of woke me up, and it gave me a lot to think about on our walk back to the monastery. But in a way, it's true. The self's will puts itself into situations to rub against what's actually happening because of, as you said, the causes and conditions that didn't start with us, in this moment. And it's that constant rub that provides some of the difficulty in coming into meditation. We think we're going to sit down and discover more peace, but first we have to meet this tendency we have to want things to be different than they are, but control, subtle or gross.
So maybe before we move on to all the other kinds of questions I wanted to ask you, since we're on emptiness, maybe this is a good time for you to lead a meditation
Okay.
that somehow illuminates that quality.
Sure. This is a meditation that I've been working with over the last few years that people have found helpful. It's really based on a section of a discourse in the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle length sayings, a sutta of the Buddha. It's Majjhima 121 for those who are interested, uh, called the Shorter Discourse on Emptiness. And when I first read about this sutta, I thought it was going to be a great philosophical exposition. It's not, it's meditation instructions. And I found them very helpful, and in sharing them, other people have found them helpful. So let's go ahead and we'll just do a few minutes in this, sometimes presented as a gradual descent into emptiness. And this is one of the early steps in it. So I'll invite you to close your eyes if that's comfortable for you. And as you're sitting quietly, let the body be relaxed, open, restful. Let yourself just feel the peacefulness of the body's stillness. And as you connect with the stillness in the body, you might just notice that there are movements in the body connected to breathing. And you might feel how the breath touches the body in different places. In the abdomen, the chest, the nose. And if we let the breath be natural, we find that it has almost a soothing quality in its rhythm. That rather than disturbing the stillness of the body, it can help to settle the stillness as the breath finds its own easy rhythm. And as we come into this experience of the body and sitting, feeling the breathing, we notice that we can feel sensations in the body really throughout, from the top of the head, through the chest and belly, the arms and legs. And as we sit quietly with this connection to the whole body, we can notice that the range of the body from the top of the head through the feet evokes a sense of space. There's a distance from the top of the head to the feet, which we can feel in our body. And there's a space within the body from the top to the bottom. We can also get the sense of a space from left to right and from back to front. So the form of the body creates or evokes this sense of spaciousness, inner space, space inside. And then we may also be able to get a sense that there is space around the body. We feel the temperature of the room on our face, on our hands. We know that air is touching us. We can have a sense that we are sitting in a bigger space of the room or the outdoors that we're in. And so we let our perception open to this sense of the space around the body, beyond the body, outside the body. And then we can ask, There's a space inside the body. There's this space beyond the body. Are these two separate spaces? Or is it really just one space demarcated by our skin? So can you get a sense of this one space that includes space inside and space outside the body? And of course, areas of transit like the nose and mouth, where one space moves into another. Then can you steady your perception in that one space? If you can steady your perception in that one space, we notice that it includes the body, but it's not limited by it. And so we are directing our attention to something that we might say transcends the body, goes beyond, while including it. And if we can sustain our perception on that space, we have stepped out a little bit of just the realm of sensations and even moods. So by placing our attention on this wide space, we've taken a first step beyond the self. The first step in this gradual descent into emptiness. And if you can let the attention rest there, in taking this step beyond self, we find a certain degree of peaceableness. It's a step beyond the constant thinking, efforts, controlling activities of selfing. And this is a step into emptiness. So when you're ready, feel free to open your eyes and come back into the room. This meditation, Majjhima 121, then goes on. This is, you might say, the first step toward a real experience of emptiness, and it goes on into the areas of consciousness, of not self, and of signlessness as it opens up to greater degrees of emptiness. And then Nibbana, or enlightenment, is considered the ultimate emptiness. So that's just a little taste.
Thank you. For A Taste of Emptiness is also a good book title, by the way, if you want a sequel.
Thank you. I like that.
Yeah, I like that too.
You're good on book titles, Sharon.
Well, thank you very much. 13 books later, I don't know that I have another book, so I can offer any title anytime,
Good resource.
So, to switch topics a little bit, or maybe a lot, you've been practicing since 1977, is that right? Or
76 was the first
76,
retreat.
okay.
And then I basically moved to IMS in 1977 to be a yogi. I
Okay.
packed up my apartment and sublet it, and moved and went on a 6-month retreat starting in May 77.
So I'm curious, in all these years, have you wavered from the path?
I haven't. It really it resonated so strongly with me from the very beginning. I mean, the fact that I did a 10-day retreat and then moved to IMS to do a 6-month retreat is just kind of an indication of how much I wanted to be immersed in the Dharma. And that basic dedication hasn't really changed. I have had to also deal with livelihood And so there have been times when I've gone away from formal dharma practice and service into the wider world to make money. But I've always come back, and once I moved into a teaching role, I realized that I could combine livelihood with dharma immersion. So once I discovered the path of vipassana, of insight meditation, my life focus has never really shifted.
Mine hasn't either. I mean, people often ask, I mean, I may have had, and I have had doubts about all kinds of things like which practice to do and can I really do it and all
Yeah.
kinds of things. But from the first night of my first Goenka retreat, which was January 7th, 1971, I haven't ever thought that there was not truth here for me, so.
Yeah, and it's always, since getting, tastes of the freedom that it offered, it's always been the kind of the most important direction for me personally. And then combined with service and how the Dharma can be a benefit to the world, been the consistent direction.
I wonder if you have some recollections of some of the most or more important things that different teachers have said to you. Like I quoted Menindra just a little while ago,
Mhm,
uh, and I have a lot of Menindra quotes actually, more than some of my other teachers, like Deepa Ma, who was very, very important for me.
mhm,
I don't have little pithy sayings so much as sort of her presence and, of course, her not more than recommendation, her insistence that I would teach,
mhm,
which
mhm.
was shocking and bizarre to me, but of course came out to be true. But uh, sometimes a teacher can say something, or even in their presence, it just turns your mind in a different direction.
Yeah, you had mentioned that this might be a topic for us to talk about, and there were 5 or 6 things from different teachers that came to my mind. One of them was, I was sitting a metta retreat at IMS and interviewing with you and Joseph, and my style in retreat at that point had been like 110%. I would just kinda give it everything from waking up in the morning, until late at night, and, we were having an interview, and maybe you saw that there was some over efforting going on for me, and you said something like, it's okay to stop and have a cup of tea in the middle of the day. And that was kind of a revelation to me. I had never considered that that would be okay to do. And so it was a pointer in the direction of relaxation that has since become a really important theme in my practice. Um, there was another question that you posed. We had a little email exchange, and you posed a question of, what would I say to my younger self? What piece of advice? Or how would I sum up directions for somebody proceeding on the meditative path? And the thing I think I would say is relax and pay attention. Because I just think if you have that quality of relaxation in there, the Dharma can do you. And if we don't have a quality of relaxation, if we think it all comes out of our hard effort, the Dharma doesn't work its magic as easily. So that was one important thing that
Oh, that's so sweet. I'm in your pantheon.
that was really helpful for me. Another one, this was at the end of the retreat at Lama Foundation in 76. You all were talking about taking the practice home, and Joseph said, try to sit for 2 hours a day in your daily life. And I think that was advice that he'd gotten from Goenkaji. Does that sound like something Goenkaji used to say?
It does actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I took that to heart. And at the time I was teaching in an alternative school in Palo Alto, and I would sit for an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening, and I kept a notebook where I tracked my hours of sitting. And I really have tried through my whole practice career to sit for 2 hours a day based on that one comment that Joseph made at the end of that retreat.
Yeah, and
Very,
part of Goenka's thing was that he was not a monastic in a country, Burma, where many teachers were monks, occasionally nuns, and his whole thing was do one retreat a year if you can, like a 10-day retreat, because that was his format, and sit 2 hours a day and live an ethical life, and all the things about bringing dharma into life. But it was not about such lengthy retreats. It was very much his advice.
yeah. I found that very helpful, and I still try to do that. Um, I find it really helps keep me, balanced and interested um, in the Dharma. One other teacher I just wanted to mention, and I'm going to ask Liz if she can put up the first photo. This is, let's see, it might be the second photo I sent you, Liz, of Ajahn Buddhadasa, if that photo is handy. Yeah. This was a bunch of us with Ajahn Buddhadasa in 1982 at Wat Suan Mok in southern Thailand, and you might recognize
Yeah. Is that Carol in the front?
that is Carol in the foreground. And I'm on Ajahn Buddhadasa's right side on the end, and Rodney Smith is next to me. And at the other end, Ajahn Buddhadasa's, well, one over, there's a fellow in yellow robes, and then the next one over is Gary Buck,
Right,
who was
that's
on
right.
staff with us in 1977. Okay. And Ajahn Buddhadasa sitting behind, he was, at this point in the Rains retreat, he was giving us teachings. This is right outside his kuti. So the Western monastics would come together and he would teach us in that setting. Okay, Liz, you can take the photo down. And I just want to mention one comment of Ajahn Buddhadasa's, where he said, he would often say, let nature be your teacher. And his monastery was a monument to that teaching because we monks lived in individual huts called kutis spread out over this 80-acre or so expanse of the monastery. And where my kuti was, I couldn't see another kuti from mine. So I felt very alone, but we could hear each other from our kuti. So I knew I wasn't alone. And, we shared communal facilities like washrooms and going to meals together. So it was such an ideal setting for coming from that place of relaxation in nature and opening up to the beauty of the Thai forest. And that was Ajahn Buddhadasa's teaching was in the form of his monastery. Let nature be your teacher. And then when I got into teaching, a little bit like with you and Deepama, I was teaching classes in sitting groups. I was in England at this point, living in Totnes in Devon. And Christopher Titmus had set it up for some of us to join this meditation community, start this meditation community called Sharpam. And I thought, okay, I'll do a little bit of class and sitting group teaching. That'll be enough. Christopher got this invitation from Germany to lead a retreat, which he wasn't able to take. And so he suggested that I go and lead the retreat. And, today I might describe myself as a teacher in training, except I wasn't actually getting any training. I was just kind of a beginning teacher on this class and talk level. And Christopher wanted me to go teach a retreat. And I said, Christopher, I'm not ready to teach a retreat. I wouldn't know how to do that. And he just shook his head and said, gosh, it would be a shame if those people didn't get to have a retreat. So I just felt I needed to go do it. So I went. That was my first retreat. 4 people were signed up. I went anyway. By the time I got there, 2 people had canceled. So I taught a week-long retreat for 2 people.
Wow,
But
how great.
it was a start.
Lucky 2 people.
Actually, I checked in with the person who ran that retreat center like 30 years later. Those 2 people were still practicing. So they had good determination and they kept with it.
That's fabulous. So I want to go back a bit and just ask you about your experience of being a monk.
It was one of the best years of my life, without a doubt. It was 1982, and being a Western monk in Thailand at that time was just a wide open field for practice in many different forms. I loved it all. Um,
Did you go out for alms round in his monastery? And
in most of the monasteries I was at, I would go out for alms round. There was one monastery that I joined, which was really more of a Vipassana retreat center than a monastery, where we didn't go out for alms round.
Mhm.
Most of them we did. If I was in the city, we would go walking the streets of Bangkok. When I was
Did you have one meal? I don't know if everyone even knows what alms round is, but is that the one meal a day you had was going out with your begging bowl?
well, the way that the way in the monastery where I was ordained, which was on the edge of Bangkok, very urban setup, I would go out on alms round quite early because that's when the people came out to offer, and it would be about a 45-minute to an hour walk, and we would get a lot of different stuff in our bowls. We would get rice, we would get little plastic bags tied up, which had either meat or fish. That people would put fruit in the bowls, and we'd normally get more than we could eat on that alms round in the city. And so we would come back, and the monks would assemble and give away what we didn't finish, um, that had been provided by all the lay people in that area who would come out. And feeding the monks was part of their own service and their own practice of generosity. That was dana. That was the dana that we lived on. At that time in Thailand, the nuns were not going on alms round, so it was just for monks, but there were plenty of nuns around. When we came back to the monastery with the food, we would put aside what we didn't need and keep in our bowl what we did. And normally, I would eat the breakfast at that time and then keep a little bit for lunch. We had to finish eating before 12, but I made 2 meals a day out of that and then gave the rest away. At Wat Suan Mok, it was a very poor rural area that we were living in, so we went out on alms round. We mostly just got white rice in our bowls. We would come back to the monastery, and the monastery would have had workers in the kitchen preparing the main meal of the day for the 50 or 60 monks and nuns that were living there. So that was our main meal service. It was only served once, but again, I could hold a little bit back, like a banana or something, until noontime, and have a little bit of a snack before lunch. So, but other monasteries, it was one meal a day, early in the morning, and that was it. But what was so inviting about the monk's life at that time is the selection of monasteries that we could go to practice in. So there was a monastery in the middle of Bangkok where one could go and do intensive style practice using the instructions of Mahasi Sayadaw. There was a monastery out in the forest and near Chiang Mai that was basically an intensive practice monastery. I had a hut there that was right near a little stream, separate from the other huts, very quiet, very suitable for practice. And there was Ajahn Buddhadas's monastery, where he had a very light touch. He basically let us stay in our huts and follow the practice that we wanted. And he was open to questions, he would give us teachings, but he wasn't checking up on us in a rigorous way. And that really brought out this quality of relaxation for me. It was just an ideal place to kind of let myself open into a relationship with the forest and deepening a practice.
Well, it seems to me too that just as generosity is its own very important aspect of practice, sometimes receiving generosity is a practice too. It's like I was not with you when you were a monk, but when I was in Burma and in the 80s at different times, our friend Steve Armstrong was a monk there, and I used to just observe him, people would pay respects to him, and it wasn't him as a person, it was the robes and what that was symbolizing, or receiving food. And of course, we as meditators received food too, because we weren't charged for anything. And every food was a donation. Every meal was a donation from a family, or sometimes a whole village would come together. And Burma was, one of the poorest countries in the world. And sometimes the kind of overt quality of the food was not very great, but they would often come to watch you eat, and they'd be so happy that their donation was feeding your practice, was fueling your practice, and hopefully your liberation. And so receiving it in that spirit and not thinking, oh God, like another meal of like that, was its own practice, which was really important.
That was a beautiful aspect of being a monk, and it really came through strongly when I was in Burma. Also, after I left the robes in Thailand, there was some part of my monk aspiration that hadn't finished, and so I went back to Burma 20 years later and ordained again. And this time I ordained with Paok Sayadaw. And Liz, if you can, maybe bring up the photograph of Paok Sayadaw. Yes, he's on the right in this photo, obviously. And I don't know if you get this sense, just the way he's standing, he is so rooted. He was so grounded within himself, and he had practiced for so many years that when he planted himself on the ground, he was just there in a very solid way. So I spent 6 weeks in robes with him, learning his method of teaching concentration practice. And the one thing I'd say about him, of all the teachers that I've met, to me, he was the one who had the vibe most like what I think the Buddha was like. And that's maybe a little bit of a stretch of an inference. And Liz, you can take the photo down now. But we don't get much of a sense from the Buddha's discourses in Pali of what his personality was like. But he had a physician named Jivaka, who was the personal physician to one of the kings, and asked Jivaka to look after the Buddha. Jivaka's comment on the Buddha's bearing was that he was really full of metta. And I believe this because of how transformative his impact was on people. That the force of his metta, I think, drew a lot of people to him. To me, that's what Paok Sayadaw also had. He was very caring and warm and kind. I would have interviews with him daily while I was practicing at the monastery. And the happiest I saw him was when I reported some progress in my meditation. And that was just his natural mudita coming through. And so the situation at the monastery, like you described, Sharon, we would line up to go through the meal line. I think there were 750 people practicing at the monastery at this point. About 450 were monks and about 150 were nuns. The rest were lay people. And we would go through the food line, and often it was a whole family or even a village that had offered the meal for that day. And they had registered months ahead to offer this food. And so they would come, and just like you said, they would watch us go through, and they would be beaming, enjoying seeing their generosity support the 750 people at that monastery. It was really a beautiful thing to be with.
Yeah, it's really extraordinary. So I also want to invite anyone who has any questions. Guy and I are going to continue talking, but if you have any questions about anything you experienced in that meditation or anything really, for Guy, you can put them in the Q&A,
Or for Sharon.
or for me. But
Please.
and there are 2 already, which I'm going to look at. Please feel free. So I'm going to turn these over. Well, certainly the first one over to Guy. Seems like an oxymoron, but is emptiness not fullness, the fullness of experiencing reality as it is?
I would agree with that. when, one way I like to think of it is when the self steps out of the way, what's left? Everything. Just as it is without our contributing more or projecting onto it or wanting more from it than it is, that's its suchness. That's things just being the way they are. And the universe is full and rich without our selfing, needing to fill it up. Beautiful.
Sometimes I use the example of I was once riding in the car with a friend, and we were stuck in this terrible, horrible, awful traffic and complaining bitterly about it the whole time. And then my friend turned to me and said, "Well, we're the traffic too, you know." And it was this moment, it's like before she said that, it was like there was a sense of center, which was us and everyone else who was kind of on the margin, and they were in our way, like those interlopers. And it was very much a sense of privilege, like it's my road. You people are slowing me down. But when she said that, it was like that center to everything, that solid center dropped out, and there was just us, and we were all traffic. And I actually came to feel that that is maybe the best place to try to resolve the problem of traffic. It's like the problem did not go away. It's like everything didn't morph into this soup, where nothing matters. But that kind of solid center with everyone else on the outside. So that's one of my examples of
Yeah.
anatta and the fullness of life in all of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. I love that, Sharon. I had a similar experience. I was shopping in a supermarket not long ago, and it was quite crowded. It was a busy shopping day and people all around, and I was feeling annoyed that people were in my way when I was trying to get to things. And all of a sudden I noticed the irritation, and I thought, why does this have to be here? And so what helped let it go is I got more interested in the people than where they were in my path. And then it also opened up to that sense of fullness, but also compassion, that we were all, trying to do our best in those crowded conditions. So it was a real sense of ease and connection.
Hey, another question. Could you speak on using Dzogchen, which is a particular school in Tibetan Buddhism, particular approach in Tibetan Buddhism? Can you speak on using Dzogchen's pointing out instructions for realizing the no self experience? And any thoughts on using this instruction occasionally in normal Vipassana practice, like when sitting in open awareness?
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question for me, because I have done a fair bit of Dzogchen practice over the past 20, 30 years with some Tibetan teachers. And it's been a very helpful practice for me. I think it's an excellent complement to Vipassana practice. I always suggest that people find their home ground in one spiritual tradition and then open to other influences, but make sense of the other influences from our home base. So I've chosen to keep my center within the Vipassana world and Theravada and Pali Canon, and then to kind of incorporate influences from Dzogchen, Mahamudra, Zen, from a Vipassana point of view. And I find if I do that, I make my own interpretation of the other teachings I've received, and it can integrate them effectively into my Vipassana practice, just as you're suggesting. So the pointing out instruction, and I'm not a teacher in the Dzogchen lineage, so I don't want to go into much specificity about this, but it's intended to reveal a dimension of our mind that we may not have tuned into before. And what's interesting is that this discourse in the Majjhima that I was talking about earlier, the shorter discourse on emptiness, starts with this perception. I was encouraging us all to steady our perception in space, which as we explore it becomes boundless. The next step in that meditation, which you can find if you read the discourse, is to turn from noticing the space to ask, what's knowing that space? What's conscious of that space? And if the space is boundless, what's knowing it must also be boundless. So this is called, in the Pali terms, the perception of boundless consciousness. And so that then becomes a meditation focus in this, you might say, extended Vipassana style of practice. And I find it very insightful because from that place of space and consciousness, the self becomes thinner. The phenomena that are coming and going are lightly touching us. As we add in more expansiveness to the attention, the individual contacts get less intense. So there's a sense of spaciousness that's holding a less intense experience, and that gives a greater sense of freedom. So I think that one can take the pointings from teachings like Dzogchen, translate some of the pointing into Vipassana instructions, and find an avenue to greater freedom within our Vipassana practice.
I mean, one way of beginning to understand the relationship, and it's like a lot of Vipassana practice is evolutionary. Like we start out maybe observing the breath, we move to observing sensation and thoughts and feelings and so on. And then at some point, even quite naturally, we begin paying attention to the knowing itself, to consciousness itself. Like what is aware? Who is aware of that thought, that feeling? And this is just a natural evolution. And that emphasis on paying attention to awareness itself rather than the object coming and going is where Dzogchen kind of emerges.
Mhm.
You know, that's in a way where that approach starts. And so you can see the relationship if you practice both. And there is an approach. It's almost, for some teachers within Dzogchen, it's a ceremony almost, you know, of bringing you to a deeper sense of looking at awareness itself. And that's the pointing out instruction. And so that's like if you're studying these days with a Tibetan teacher, a Dzogchen teacher on Zoom, that will be the part they don't record.
Mhm.
You know, that it's happening in the room in the presence of the teacher. And for some, it's very, like I said, it's kind of ceremonial. For some, it's very casual almost. It's not like a big thing in a way. It's just helping you relax enough to come in to that other approach. So I think if you look at Guy and I share some Tibetan teachers, you know, like Sonny Rinpoche. If you look at his approach, you will see a lot of similarities to,
Mhm.
like I used a whole section from Sonny Rinpoche's teaching in one of the most recent books I wrote, which is called Real Life. And it was about moving from contraction or feeling trapped to expansion. And he has a practice which he calls handshake practice. And it's basically when something emerges in our mind, like greed and jealousy and fear and hatred, one of those things, he calls them beautiful monsters. And the teaching is to, when you see a beautiful monster of your own, not to freak out, you know, and try to push it away or feel ashamed of it. And also not to get all wrapped up in it and let it consume you. But his advice is shake its hand. That's handshake practice. So that reminded me from beginning to end of everything I ever heard about mindfulness, right? And interestingly enough for me, because I have a lot of different approaches in that section of the book. I have RAIN, RAIN, which is another popular mindfulness approach. Recognize what's happening, accept it, investigate it, don't identify with it, non-identification. And I had a whole list. And when I was being interviewed, like by journalists about the book, the thing everyone picked up on was handshake practice. And I would think, yeah, I know, I've been doing it, but I call it something else, you know. It's just
Mhm.
very interesting. But it is sometimes it's very powerful when you're used to a certain languaging, a certain way of expressing the teachings to kind of check out other things, and you think, oh, look at that, that's interesting, or that reflects my own experience. Sometimes I didn't even have words for it before.
Yeah, I think that handshake image or metaphor really resonates for a lot of people. Rain sounds a little more scientific or a little cold, but the images sometimes really warm people up. But I'm glad you mentioned that this approach of noticing the knowing is kind of a natural evolution, because as I've been teaching awareness practices in a Vipassana context, I will, often have people come up and say, "Oh, I got there after a few years of doing Vipassana. That's where I started to go naturally." And then having it be kind of validated as a good formal practice and maybe tuned up a little bit with some other suggestions and techniques has been really helpful for people.
Two more questions.
Sure.
In thinking about a split second or moment of experiencing emptiness, can you be in emptiness partially, like 10%, 50%, etc., or is it a 1 or 0 experience?
I see it as a spectrum. The far end of it is so, the direct realization of nibbana is kind of where the emptiness development can go. But short of that, we have a lot of inklings of it. I can't tell you how many times on a retreat I've had a practice meeting with someone who's come in and said, "Oh, I just had a not self experience." And they range from, full blown to kind of just a clear intuition of the, all the ones that I've talked to with people have been valid. So we get, I'd say it's like opening of a flower. We get more and more opening to this understanding as time goes by, and sometimes it opens really big. And even after opening really big, sometimes it will, not be so accessible for a while, but we just continue with our moment to moment mindfulness and it opens up again that way. So I consider it ever deepening, not at all a binary or 0 1 kind of thing. A lot of depth in that understanding.
Okay, one more question for you so far, and please do feel free. We still have a little bit more time if you have more questions. Where is mind?
Where is mind? Well, that's a great question. I think the fact that we can't quite put our finger on mind is what indicates its emptiness. Now, I tend to use, when we're talking in these circles, I tend to use mind as synonymous with consciousness, that which knows. In the whole spectrum of the Buddha's teachings, mind is the third foundation of mindfulness. And there, in the discourse on the foundations of mindfulness, the Buddha describes it as what are the qualities of the mind, and is it expanded or contracted? Is it concentrated or unconcentrated? So I regard the third foundation, in Pali term is chitta, as being about the qualities of mind. But the actual functioning of mind, to me, is what knows. What knows what's happening. That's how I understand the term in this sense. And that is more or less the term consciousness or vijnana in Pali. And it's so it's important to kind of understand what vijnana is referring to. It's the most simple kind of knowing. So if you're looking at the screen right now, you might think, well, I'm knowing Sharon and I'm knowing Guy, but that's a little higher level perception. Some interpretation has come in. What you're actually seeing are colors and shapes on the screen that you're looking at. It's those colors and shapes before they're interpreted that is the level that consciousness reveals. And then our brain's processing intelligence comes in and makes sense of all that, and that's perception. So consciousness is this simple arising of phenomena at the sense door before any interpretation or recognition. It's going on all the time. And to ask where is it located, you could say either it's not locatable or it's everywhere. I sort of like that it's everywhere because that lines up with boundless consciousness, knowing boundless space. So I consider it, this is just my interpretation, I consider it pervasive. Wherever there's experience, there's consciousness or mind. You could say it's everywhere, you could say it's nowhere. Take your pick.
Nice. So another question came in from Abby. Hello, Abby. It's been a long time since I've seen you. Could you talk about emptiness in relation to the jhanas? So first, you probably have to explain what the jhanas are. And it's interesting because you put up Pao Sayadaw's photo, or we put up Pao Sayadaw's photo, and you talked about studying with him. And so it's a word that is interpreted differently and by different teachers. And so you want to take it, the jhanas, and then how emptiness relates to that.
Okay, a little bit. Jhanas from any system are considered strong states of concentration. What's a little bit subject to interpretation is how strong does the concentration have to be before it's actually called a jhana? And there are different systems popular today. Pao Sayadaw teaches one, which is based in the Visuddhimagga, and it's what I would consider a very high bar of what constitutes a jhana. I learned jhanas from Sharon, who taught me according to a system that she'd learned from Sayadaw U Pandita in Burma. And I consider Sayadaw U Pandita's jhana system a mid-level of kinds of jhanas. And then there are others that are slightly easier to access. But all of them are pointing to the ability of the mind to become so concentrated that it kind of collects around an object in what's called an absorption. And when the mind gets absorbed into an object, there's like this click feeling that happens, and it becomes very stable. To me, that's what the absorption or jhana aspect of it means. All of a sudden, the attention has become kind of locked in. And that's a strong state of concentration and brings a lot of peace. Now, jhanas are impermanent. So why would we bother for meditation experiences that we know are going to fade? Two reasons. One is they're satisfying in and of themselves. They bring along elements of pleasure and enjoyment that are very fulfilling in and of themselves. So we can discover a kind of peace and sweetness in concentration that we hadn't known was possible from our daily life. The second thing is that level of concentration, once we just step slightly out of it, provides a very stable foundation for insight to arise. So here's what I think the Buddha would say about the connection to emptiness. But the jhanas are not considered in his teachings in themselves platforms for insight. They're platforms for concentration, or you could say tranquility, samatha. In order to use them as a foundation for insight, one needs to emerge and then start to investigate. In the jhana, the mind is so collected that investigation doesn't happen easily. But once one emerges, there is still a stability that's carried over from the jhana. And then by adding investigation, insight can really open up. One of the main insights that is meant to come out of jhana is around the three characteristics: insight into impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and not self. So that lends itself immediately to the perception of emptiness as not self. In addition, there are these higher jhana states called, tell me if this sounds familiar, boundless space, boundless consciousness, nothingness, and signlessness, or neither perception nor non-perception. So we can approach some of those higher jhana states from a place that's not absorbed, and they are part of the gradual descent into emptiness. in that discourse from the Middle Length Sayings, Majjhima 121. But we don't have to have the absorption level of concentration to be able to peer into them and use the freedom of those states to open us to deepening understanding of emptiness. Some connection.
There's also, depending on the approach you were kind of trained in. I mean, certainly classically, if you read the suttas, the teachings of the Buddha, you see jhanas, these absorption states, mentioned quite a lot. But, so much of my own training after a little while, not go with Goenka, but by the time I was studying with, say, Sayadaw U Pandita, which was the 80s, who was a student of Mahasi Sayadaw, then Mahasi Sayadaw's approach historically was very interesting because if you define jhana as a fairly high bar, as Guy was saying, then, and if you felt like a jhanic level of concentration was needed before you could open up your awareness and do basically mindfulness practice, looking at lots of things coming and going, developing insight into things like the nature of change, then the possibility of doing insight meditation to actually be liberated, to actually be free, was pretty well held by monks, because who else had the time, to spend all that time doing concentration and not being distracted and not having journal living and all these things, so that you could get these jhanic states and from there launch into a state of, or a practice of insight meditation. And Mahasi Sayadaw, at the turn of the 20th century, and some of his friends came along, and through his own scholarship, he said, I don't think that's true. And his own experience, he said, you need some concentration in order to do insight meditation. Otherwise, every single thought is going to take you on a long, 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 long train of distraction. But you don't need that much. Actually, you don't need a jhanic level. And remember, they have a pretty high bar for what means, or I would say mid, but, mid to high level compared to some usages of the word. And so he said, you need some concentration, but not all that much. And so his approach was that you could get all the concentration that you needed to do a liberating insight meditation by continuity of awareness. And that's why that's a school where if you're on retreat, they'll say, notice everything you experienced when you stood up from the meditation. Notice everything you experienced when you drank a cup of tea, things like that. And so it was revolutionary, and it, in terms of society, it returned the prospect of a liberating practice to women, to lay people, and was very controversial. By the time we met Mahasi Sayadaw, he was quite old. He was extremely chill in his persona. But when he was young and promoting these ideas, I heard, he was going to more conservative places like Sri Lanka, and people used to throw rocks at him because he was such a heretic. So my comment was, it's like finding out your grandmother was a Bolshevik when she was young. It was like so startling a thought, because he was so chill and dignified, but there it was. So we are the recipients of many people, and their depth of inquiry and their effort to really understand these teachings and make them available. So I am afraid we need to stop. But I want to thank you guys so much, and thank you all for being here. I so much wanted to talk about emptiness. I got to do it.
Sharon, thank you for having me. Really enjoyed, a chance to hang out and chat with you, and fun to see a lot of old friends in the Zoom faces on our screen. So thanks a lot. It was, for me, it was a lot of fun. I'm glad we got to do it.
Great. Thank you.
Hey folks, thanks so much for listening. If you'd like to learn more about IMS Online, which is the virtual arm of the Insight Meditation Society. You can head over to their website, dharma.org, dharma.org/IMS-online. And I would point you to Guy Armstrong's website, but he does not have a website. So you can learn more about him either through the IMS website, dharma.org, or through Spirit Rock, which is spiritrock.org. And get yourself a copy of his book, Emptiness, a practical guide for meditators, and all the different places that books are sold. For all things Sharon, including a free guided meditation, her different online courses, and various writings and podcasts, you can head over to SharonSalzberg.com. This has been the Metta Hour podcast, brought to you by the Be Here Now Network. May you be safe, may you be happy, may you be healthy, and may you live with ease.